Hello, and welcome to your Generalized Linear Models 3 lecture. Now, we've been talking a lot about generalized linear models, how to run them, and also extensions that we can use to make a generalized linear model fit to the case that we actually need. And today is no different. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about random effects or mixed effect models, which include both random effects and fixed effects. So before we even start, one of the things that I have to point out is that mixed effect models have like a million different names, and I don't know where they all came from. Honestly, sometimes it feels like every single field independently discovered mixed effect models came up with its own name, and for some reason we've gotten rid of none of them. So this is a meme I made years ago about this, which sort of gives you an idea of how many different ways people refer to mixed effect models. But I will say mixed effect model is probably the most common way to refer to these, so that's what we're going to use. All right, so we've talked extensively about linear models, but let's say we're predicting the effect of fundraising, so the number of dollars we raise when we're fundraising, on standardized test scores for a school. But let's say that we are measuring students from 5 different schools. Would it be reasonable to say that each school probably has a different baseline standardized test score? In other words, the average test score of each school, would it all be the same, or might each school, for various reasons, have different baselines? Well, it's really likely that that's the case for various reasons, since all of these different schools have different things that are kind of impacting what their standardized test scores are. So one option that we have to overcome this issue is to fit a separate intercept for each school. So instead of having just an overall intercept of like what is the baseline school score and then what is the impact of fundraising, we can actually make this a little more tailored to the individual schools by saying each individual school gets a separate intercept. So the intercept for school A, school B, school C, etc. But if we do this, we're basically saying that each school is completely independent of the other ones. But what if we think that each school might also have a different effect from fundraising? Like, let's say there's a school that's already in a very predominantly wealthy area. Maybe they are going to benefit less from the fundraising because they already had a lot of money. So when they fundraise, it's for little things that maybe don't impact schools as much. Whereas with really low funded schools, they might benefit hugely from every single dollar they can raise. Well, we can fix that in a really similar way. We can fit both a separate intercept and a separate slope for each school, meaning that each school has a different baseline test score, and each school can react differently to raising a single dollar. So the coefficient for fundraising dollars could be different for each school. Okay, great. Now we've figured out the solution to the problems we were having. Essentially, we can just fit separate regressions to every single school. Great. However, if you think about it a little more deeply, you might realize that there are at least some inefficiencies, if not some problems here. First, we're throwing away information. If we know that school A's slope is 0.01, so test scores go up 0.01 points for every dollar that's fundraised, that actually kind of tells us that school B's coefficient should probably not be 10,000, right? If one school is only getting these small nudges from every dollar fundraised, we don't think that other schools should have huge, like 10,000 point increases from raising a single dollar. The second problem that we have is that we can't generalize our findings to other schools. Let's say we measured 5 schools in the entire country, but we want to generalize our results to all schools in the country. If we solve our problems by simply having basically different regression coefficients and intercepts for each school, we still have these 2 problems. So what could we do instead? Well, we could use a random effect. Essentially what this means is that we're assuming that all of the school effects, so the intercepts and the coefficients are drawn from population distributions of these effects. So essentially, we're saying that the intercepts of each individual school are drawn from a population distribution with some mean and some variance, and the same thing goes for the coefficients on fundraising dollars. Each of those coefficients is drawn from a normal distribution with some mean and some variance. Now we've learned something interesting. We're still solving the problems that we did before, right? Each school is allowed to vary in both their baseline and their coefficient. However, now we can also generalize our finding to other schools by, instead of just learning individual coefficients, learning these population means and standard deviations. Essentially what we're saying is, okay, we don't necessarily care about every single individual school, but we do care about the population distribution of baseline scores and coefficients. So we've solved that problem. The other thing we solved is by saying that we think that these effects are drawn from a normal distribution with mean and variance parameters that we're going to learn, we're essentially allowing the different schools to learn from each other, right? That other problem we had was that we want to be able to take advantage of information from school A and use it to help school B, right? If school A has an effect of 0.01, we don't think that school B is going to have an effect of 10,000. And this structure also allows us to do that. Now, the reason mixed effect models are called mixed effect models is because they have both random effects, which we just discussed, and they have fixed effects. Fixed effects are essentially everything we've talked about before talking about random effects, but they're essentially values where the parameter values are fixed. And if you ever Google this or ask ChatGPT what the difference between a random effect and a fixed effect is, you're going to get like 30 million different answers. And honestly, I think people are still arguing today about how to distinguish between random effects and fixed effects. So I like to basically think about, should something be a random effect or a fixed effect based on what the actual data is and how you want to handle it. Now, a random effect is essentially saying that the parameter values that we're drawing are randomly drawn from a population with some mean and some standard deviation. Essentially, if we're not observing all the levels of a variable that we're interested in generalizing to, for instance, we want to generalize to all schools and we only have a sample of 5 or 100 schools, then that's probably going to be a random effect. Whereas fixed effects are parameter values that, like the name implies, are fixed. They're not drawn from a normal distribution. In essence, we are observing all the levels of a variable that we're interested in. So for instance, if we have, a treatment group in an experimental design, right? Some people get treated, some people don't. Then we have every single possible value that variable could take on. You're either in the treatment or you're not in the treatment. And because those are the only groups that we want to generalize to, we are going to use a fixed effect to model them. All right, so let's take a look at some data so that we can see a little bit more about how random and fixed effects work. So we're going to look at this data. It's a sleep study, and essentially we have a bunch of different people who have been sleep deprived for a various number of days, and then we make them do a task and we measure their reaction time. Now, if we just plot the data by participant, one of the things that we see is that every participant kind of has a different pattern of what the impact of days of sleep deprivation is on them. Now, one thing I want to pause and talk about is this assumption that we talked about with regular linear regression, which is that all of the observations are IID, right? They're independent and identically distributed. And I want to focus on that independent part. Now, if we are measuring the same person multiple times, then the observations in our data set are no longer independent. If we know someone's reaction time on day 1, that probably gives us some information on what their reaction time will be on day 3 or 5 or 7. So we're no longer actually adhering to the assumption of independence. So we probably, as we've been learning throughout the class, if we're going to violate that assumption, we probably need to account for it in our model. And essentially, random effects are one way to do that. Okay, back to what we were saying. Basically what we said is different people have different reactions to the sleep deprivation, although it does generally seem that most people have slower or worse reaction times as time goes on. Now, another thing that you might want to pay attention to is that a couple of our participants, maybe the fake ones that we added, don't have a lot of data. See 373 and 374 here, basically don't have all of the data like the rest of the observations do. Okay, so let's say we want to answer the question, how does days of sleep deprivation affect average reaction time? Well, we have a couple of different options, just like when we were talking about the schools and the fundraising money. One thing we could do is called complete pooling. This is essentially where all subjects are pooled together and they share all of their information. Essentially, we're ignoring that different observations come from different participants. So all we're doing is a basic linear regression that models reaction time based on an intercept and some coefficient, which tells us how days of sleep deprivation affects their reaction time. Now note, this does not consider the fact that each participant is a person being measured multiple times, and we're kind of throwing away any information that we could get from that knowledge. Another option we have besides complete pooling is no pooling. This is essentially fitting a separate regression for every single subject. What we're doing is allowing every single subject to have their own slope, here, and their own intercept, and we don't share any information between participants. So as you can tell, these are sort of the extreme ends of the spectrum. We can either treat every single person as the same and put them all in one pool, estimate the regression model, or we could treat everyone as completely different and essentially fit a separate regression for every single person. So everyone has their own intercept and everyone has their own slope. However, as you can tell from this kind of Goldilocks setup that I have going on, we might want a solution that's not complete pooling, not no pooling, but somewhere in the middle. And why might we want this? Well, complete pooling essentially ignores that repeated measurements from a person are going to have useful information, or maybe that different people are going to have pretty different reactions to sleep deprivation. Whereas no pooling basically says that we're not allowed to learn from one participant to another. If we learn that one person has a positive effect of sleep deprivation, in essence meaning as you get more sleep deprived, your reaction time goes up, we basically in that scenario aren't allowed to then say, oh, the effect is probably also positive for participant B. Here you can see an image that shows the slope of the regression line for the complete and the no pooling cases. Now, for some participants, the lines are really similar, but for others, for instance, here you can see up here, the lines and the kind of like conclusions that we would make are incredibly different. You may also notice that when we are looking at the no pooling solution, our two participants that don't have complete data have pretty bad estimates. For instance, we can't even get an estimate for this person because we only observed them once. And for this person, where we only observed them twice, we really don't know what would have happened in the remaining days. So we probably shouldn't trust this estimate a lot. Okay, so what is our Goldilocks solution? Well, it's something called partial pooling, and it's essentially exactly what we talked about. We're going to use random effects. And remember before I said, there's some rules of thumb people use. I gave the example of like whether or not you've observed every level of a variable that you want to generalize to as a way to decide if something is going to be a fixed or a random effect. But truly what you should do when you're deciding between a fixed and a random effect is understand partial pooling and decide whether you want to apply it. Random effects have partial pooling and fixed effects don't. Like we discussed before, in partial pooling, the effects are allowed to be different for every participant. Every participant can have a different baseline reaction time and a different reaction or coefficient when it looks at sleep deprivation. However, we assume that these effects are normally distributed about some population mean and variance. In lay people's terms, what this tells you is that all subjects can learn from each other, but all subject separation is preserved, meaning everyone can have a different intercept and slope. but those intercepts and slopes are allowed to learn from each other. Here is the same plot from before that shows complete pooling and no pooling, what those regression lines would look like for each participant. But we've now also added partial pooling to that list. And you can see that partial pooling is often a compromise between what the complete pooling and the no pooling solutions would be. Now, one thing that's really interesting when you look at the partial pooling regression lines is that for some participants, the partial pooling line is basically the same as the no pooling or the complete pooling, and for other participants, it's very different. For instance, let's look at this participant in the top left corner here. Notice their partial pooling regression line is basically the same as the no pooling. Remember, no pooling is where we fit individual regression lines for every single participant. Now, if you look at their data, maybe it makes sense why this is the case. This person has a very extreme set of data. There's a lot of very clear evidence that you can even just visually see that say that this person has a very steep regression line. Because there's kind of overwhelming evidence of this in the data, we get a partial pooling estimate that's pretty similar to if we just fit a regression line for this individual person. Whereas for other people, maybe in the bottom right, you can see that the partial pooling estimate is completely different from the no pooling estimate. That's because this participant, 374, doesn't give us strong evidence of anything. Now, technically, you can see the no pooling line was fit to the 2 points of data that we have, but we only have 2 points of data. All of the other participants seem to have like 9, 10 points of data. So essentially what we're saying here is, yeah, we think that the orange no pooling line is what this participant was seeing, but we really don't have strong evidence of it because we only observed them on 2 different days. And one of the beauties of partial pooling is that it kind of takes that into account. At the top left, we saw that when there's really strong evidence that the regression line for this person should be different, the regression line is different. However, in cases where we just don't have a lot of information, the partial pooling estimate is going to be a lot more similar to our complete pooling. Essentially what this does is in cases where there's not a lot of signal, we drag our estimates closer to the population average. And when there's a lot of signal, we allow our estimates to be dragged towards what the data say they are. And it turns out that is exactly what's happening. One of the ways that you can kind of think about random effects is as regularization, right? We've talked about regularization in kind of prerequisite courses, like how we use regularization with Ridge and Lasso to regularize like the regression coefficients. This is also a form of regularization. Essentially, when we have really strong information or strong signal in the data that our coefficient estimates for an individual should be different than the group mean, great, we let them be different than the group mean. However, when we don't have very strong evidence, maybe it's a really highly variable pattern that we're seeing, or we just don't have a lot of data, then those estimates get regularized towards the group mean. Essentially what this means is because we're regularizing our estimates, if we don't have strong evidence that something should be extreme, we try and drag it more towards the average. You can also think of this as, extreme claims require extreme proof. So if we think that someone has a coefficient estimate, whether it's the slope or an intercept that is really atypical, we basically say, oh, you need to really prove that that's the case. And if you can prove it, sure. If you can't, I'm going to drag you towards the average. All right, so we've talked a lot about partial pooling. Partial pooling is what makes random effects random. Essentially, we're assuming that the effects that we see for different groups have some population distribution that they're sampled from. This has the effect of regularizing our estimates. If something is going to be extreme, we have to have a lot of evidence that it's going to be extreme. Otherwise, it's going to be dragged in towards the population average. Now, if that's something you want to do to your estimates because you, say, want to learn those population values so you can generalize to other schools or something like that, great. However, if you don't want to do that, then you might want to use a fixed effect. Fixed effects are essentially using no pooling. For instance, if we're estimating a treatment versus a control group, we could use no pooling and basically say, okay, these two effects are going to be fit completely separately. We don't want to learn from the treatment effect using information from the control effect. However, in cases like when we're looking at individual subjects' reaction to something or, the baseline test scores of different schools, we might want to regularize those. We think that different schools' baseline test scores give us some information about the baseline test scores of other schools, so we might want to use a random effect for them. Again, like I said, fixed and random effects are kind of confusing when you're thinking about how do I choose if something should be a fixed effect or a random effect. But what I want you to reframe that as is, do I want to use partial pooling for these coefficients or not? If you do, use a random effect. If you don't, use a fixed effect. All right, in class, we'll talk a little bit about what these models look like and how you might actually fit them. But that's all I have for you. I will see you next time.